You're just an expense now, Mom. Those 6 words shattered 73 years of love, sacrifice, and unwavering faith into pieces so small they could never be put back together again. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if you, for even a second, feel that this sounds familiar, I just ask that you leave a like and subscribe, because this story might help someone draw closer to God's love. Amen. Margaret Ann Whitaker sat in her small bedroom in Chicago, Illinois, staring at the faded photograph on her nightstand. The silver frame held a picture of her son Nathan at his high school graduation. 17 years old, wearing that crooked smile she'd fallen in love with the moment he was born. His cap was slightly askew, just like it had been during his kindergarten Christmas play, when he forgot his lines and she'd whispered them from the audience, her heart bursting with pride. The room smelled of lavender sachets and arthritis cream, a combination that had become as much a part of her identity as the worn leather Bible she clutched in her weathered hands. At 73, Margaret's fingers moved slower across the familiar pages of Psalms, but her faith remained as steady as the grandfather clock that chimed every hour in the hallway outside her door. She wore a simple blue nightgown, the kind her late mother would have called practical, with tiny flowers that had faded from countless gentle washes. Her gray hair, once the color of autumn wheat, was pulled back in a neat bun secured with bobby pins that had seen better decades. Around her neck hung a small silver cross, not expensive, but precious beyond measure because Nathan had given it to her for Mother's Day when he was 12, using money he'd earned raking leaves for the neighbors. The house was quiet, except for the distant murmur of the television downstairs, where Nathan and his wife Carrie were watching their evening programs. Margaret had long since stopped joining them in the living room. The looks had become too much to bear. Those silent exchanges between husband and wife when they thought she wasn't watching, the way conversations died when she entered a room, the gentle but firm suggestions that perhaps she should rest when company was coming over. Margaret opened her Bible to Psalm 27, a passage that had comforted her through her husband's death 15 years ago, through the lonely nights when arthritis kept her awake, through the growing realization that she'd somehow become a burden in the home where she'd once been the heart. "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear?" she whispered, her voice barely audible in the stillness. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the familiar words seemed to echo back to her hollow and meaningless, as if God himself had stepped away from her prayers. She'd been living with Nathan and Carrie for 8 months now, ever since she'd sold her little house. The house where she'd raised Nathan as a single mother after his father abandoned them when the boy was only 7 years old. She'd given Nathan every penny from that sale, $870,000, her life's work, her security, her independence, all handed over with trembling hands and a trusting heart because he'd promised to take care of her. "You shouldn't be alone anymore, Mom," he'd said, embracing her in the driveway of the house where she'd kissed his scraped knees and helped him with homework and taught him to pray. "Let us take care of you for once." The irony wasn't lost on her that she felt more alone now than she ever had in that little house with its creaky floors and drafty windows. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Nathan's voice came through the door, gentle but strained. "Mom, can I come in? We need to talk." Margaret's heart clenched with a familiar anxiety. These talks had become more frequent lately. Discussions about her medication costs, her doctor appointments, the way she sometimes forgot to turn off the kitchen light. Each conversation chipped away at her dignity like water-eroding stone, slow but relentless. "Of course, honey," she said, closing her Bible and smoothing the covers across her lap. "Come in." Nathan entered, and Margaret's breath caught as she saw the man her little boy had become. At 46, he was successful, well-dressed even in his casual clothes, with the confident bearing of someone who commanded respect in boardrooms and country clubs. But his eyes held a weariness that hadn't been there when he was young and full of dreams she'd helped nurture with countless sacrifices. He sat on the edge of her bed, but not close enough to touch. The distance between them felt infinite, despite the mere 2 feet of floral comforter that separated mother from son. "Mom, Carrie and I have been talking," he began, his voice taking on the careful, measured tone he used in business meetings, "about your situation. Margaret's hands tightened involuntarily on her Bible. My situation? Your expenses, Nathan clarified, avoiding her eyes. The medical bills, the medications, the extra utilities. Mom, it's adding up to more than we anticipated. The words hit her like physical blows. This was her son, the baby she'd nursed through pneumonia when he was 3, and she couldn't afford both medicine and groceries, choosing his health over her own hunger. The boy she'd worked double shifts to buy baseball cleats for. The teenager she'd supported through college by cleaning office buildings at night after her day job at the grocery store. I didn't realize I was costing so much, Margaret said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. I try to be careful with the utilities. I keep my room cold. I don't watch much television. Nathan's jaw tightened with frustration, though whether at her or the situation she couldn't tell. It's not just that, Mom. It's everything. Doctor visits, prescription costs, the special food you need. And honestly, Carrie is struggling with having someone else in the house all the time. Margaret felt something crack inside her chest, a sound like dry wood splintering under too much weight. I could try to find somewhere else to go. Maybe there's a senior community. With what money, Mom? Nathan's voice carried an edge she'd never heard before. You gave us everything when you sold the house, remember? You said you trusted us to make the right decisions for you. The room fell silent except for the grandfather clock marking another hour of Margaret's diminishing existence. She stared at her hands, weathered from 73 years of caring for others, and felt the weight of her complete dependence settling over her like a burial shroud. I see, she said finally. Nathan stood, straightening his shoulders in a gesture that reminded her painfully of his father, the man who'd walked away when responsibility became inconvenient. Look, Mom, I don't want you to think we don't love you. We do, but we have to be realistic about this situation. Margaret looked up at him, this stranger wearing her son's face, and felt the last ember of hope in her heart flicker and die. What are you saying, Nathan? He met her eyes for the first time since entering the room, and she saw in them the cold calculation of a man who'd learned to view human relationships through the lens of cost-benefit analysis. I'm saying that you're just an expense now, Mom. The words hung in the air between them like a death sentence, final and irreversible. Margaret felt the world tilt sideways, reality shifting into something unrecognizable and cruel. This was her son, her baby, the child she'd loved more than her own life, and she had become nothing more than a line item in his budget, a problem to be solved, a burden to be managed. Nathan seemed to realize the weight of what he'd said, because he quickly added, I didn't mean it like that. I just meant, financially speaking. But Margaret had stopped listening. She was remembering a winter night 36 years ago when Nathan was 10, and burning with fever, delirious and calling for her in the darkness. She'd sat by his bed for 3 days straight, bathing his forehead with cool cloths, and praying to God with every fiber of her being to spare her child. She'd promised anything, everything, if only Nathan would get well. God had answered that prayer. Nathan had recovered, grown strong, built a life for himself, and now she was just an expense. I understand, Margaret said quietly, her voice steady despite the earthquake in her soul. I think I'd like to rest now. Nathan hesitated at the door, perhaps sensing that something irreversible had just occurred between them. Mom, Good night, Nathan. He left, closing the door with a soft click that sounded like the final note of a funeral dirge. Margaret sat alone in her room, surrounded by the few possessions she'd been allowed to keep from her old life, the photograph, the Bible, a music box that played Amazing Grace when wound. She felt smaller than she'd ever felt before, diminished to nothing more than the sum of her medical bills and grocery costs. Outside her window, Chicago's lights twinkled like stars, each one representing a life being lived, a family sharing love, a mother being cherished by grateful children. But inside this house, this beautiful house bought with her money, Margaret had become invisible, a ghost haunting rooms where she was no longer welcome. She opened her Bible again, this time to the book of Job, and began to read through tears that blurred the ancient words of comfort and faith. Margaret lay awake until dawn, her mind swimming through decades of memories that now felt like evidence in a trial where she was both witness and defendant. Each sacrifice she'd made for Nathan played out in vivid detail, mocking her with their futility. She remembered the winter of 1987 when Nathan was 14 and desperately wanted a leather jacket like the popular kids wore. Margaret had been working as a secretary at a law firm by day and cleaning office buildings at night, her hands raw from industrial cleaning chemicals, her back aching from bending over countless trash cans and toilets. The jacket cost $200, more than their monthly grocery budget. "I know it's a lot, Mom," Nathan had said, his teenage voice cracking with want. "But if I don't fit in, I'll never make friends. I'll never be anyone." Margaret had looked at her son's hopeful face and seen herself at his age, awkward, desperate to belong, wearing hand-me-downs that marked her as poor. She'd worked an extra job that winter, wrapping presents at the mall during her lunch breaks and weekends, her fingers numb from the cold walk between buses. On Christmas morning, when Nathan unwrapped that jacket, his joy had filled their tiny apartment like sunlight. He'd worn it every day for 3 years until he outgrew it. Now she wondered if he even remembered. Then there was Nathan's senior year of high school when he'd been accepted to Northwestern University. His dream school, but completely beyond their means. The financial aid covered tuition, but room and board, books, and living expenses would require $15,000 they didn't have. Margaret had sold her engagement ring, the only valuable thing she owned, the last connection to the brief happiness she'd known before Nathan's father left them. She'd told Nathan it was money from a small inheritance from a distant aunt, unable to bear the thought of her son starting his adult life burdened by the weight of her sacrifices. "Mom, you're amazing," he'd said, hugging her tight. "I'm going to make you so proud. I'm going to take care of you when I'm successful, I promise." She'd believed him with every fiber of her being. At Northwestern, Nathan had discovered a world Margaret could barely imagine. Fraternity parties, spring break trips, internships with prestigious firms. When he called home, which became less and less frequent, he spoke of friends whose parents were doctors and lawyers and business owners. Margaret had noticed how his voice changed when he mentioned her job, how he'd started saying she worked in an office, rather than admitting she cleaned them. During his junior year, Nathan had called in tears. He'd been caught cheating on an important exam and faced suspension unless he could prove extraordinary circumstances that had affected his performance. "I told them about Dad leaving us," he'd sobbed into the phone. "I told them how hard it's been for you, raising me alone. They said if you write a letter explaining our financial struggles, they might give me another chance." Margaret had written that letter, pouring her heart onto paper about their years of poverty, her multiple jobs, their sacrifices. She'd exposed their most private struggles, their most shameful moments, anything that might save Nathan's future. The university had been moved by her honesty and given Nathan a second chance. He'd graduated with honors. But at the graduation ceremony, when his friends asked about his family, Nathan had introduced Margaret simply as, "my mom," quickly changing the subject when anyone showed interest in learning more about the woman who'd made his success possible. After college, Nathan had landed a job at a prestigious consulting firm in Chicago. Margaret had been so proud, bragging to her coworkers about her son, the consultant, though she wasn't entirely sure what consulting meant. She'd framed his first business card and kept it on her kitchen table like a shrine. Nathan's success had brought new challenges. He'd needed professional clothes, a car, money for client dinners and networking events. Each request came with promises of repayment once I get established, assurances that this was an investment in their shared future. Margaret had cashed in her small retirement account, $8,000 accumulated over 20 years of minimum wage work, to help Nathan buy his first suit and make the security deposit on his apartment. She'd told herself it was temporary, that Nathan would pay her back with interest once his career took off. The payback never came, but the requests continued. When Nathan met Carrie at a company Christmas party, Margaret had been thrilled. Carrie was beautiful, educated, from a good family in the suburbs. She seemed to genuinely care for Nathan, and Margaret had dared to hope for grandchildren, for a daughter-in-law who might become the family she'd never had. But Carrie came from money, and Margaret quickly realized how her own modest background reflected poorly on Nathan in his new social circle. At their engagement party, held at Carrie's parents' country club, Margaret had felt like an imposter in her department store dress, watching Nathan's future in-laws discuss vacation homes and investment portfolios, while she calculated whether she could afford a wedding gift that wouldn't embarrass her son. The wedding had been a $40,000 affair that Nathan insisted was modest by today's standards. Margaret had contributed $5,000, her entire savings account, toward the reception, money she'd been setting aside for her own eventual funeral expenses. She'd watched Nathan and Carrie dance to a string quartet, surrounded by flowers that cost more than Margaret's monthly rent, and felt invisible among the guests who spoke of things she'd never experienced. During the father-son dance, adapted to a mother-son dance since Nathan's father was absent, Nathan had whispered in her ear, "Thank you for everything, Mom. I know this is all because of your sacrifices." Those words had sustained her through the lean years that followed, when Nathan's visits became monthly, then sporadic, then limited to major holidays. She'd told herself he was busy building his career, that his distance was temporary, that success required sacrifice from both of them. When Margaret turned 65, Nathan and Carrie had bought their first house, a beautiful colonial in Winnetka with 4 bedrooms and a 3-car garage. Margaret had been invited to the housewarming party, where she'd stood in the marble foyer surrounded by Nathan's colleagues and their wives, everyone discussing their children's private schools and family trips to Europe. "This is my mother," Nathan had said when introducing her to his boss. "She's retired now." He'd made it sound like a choice rather than a necessity, failing to mention that her retirement consisted of a Social Security check that barely covered her rent and utilities. That night, Margaret had lain in her own small apartment, windows that didn't quite close properly, a heater that required constant attention, and wondered if she'd failed somehow as a mother. Had she loved Nathan too much? Not enough? Had her sacrifices spoiled him? Or had they simply been insufficient to buy the kind of loyalty she'd assumed was natural between mother and child? Years passed. Margaret's arthritis worsened, making her secretarial work increasingly difficult. When the law firm downsized and eliminated her position, Nathan had seemed genuinely concerned. He'd called more frequently, asking about her health, her finances, her ability to manage on her own. "I worry about you living alone," he'd said during one of their phone conversations. "What if you fall? What if something happens and no one knows?" Margaret had been touched by his concern, interpreting it as evidence that her son still loved her, still valued her presence in his life. When he'd suggested she sell her little house and move in with his family, she'd seen it as an answer to prayers she'd been too proud to pray. "We have more than enough space," Nathan had assured her. "And with the money from your house, you'll be completely secure. We'll make sure you're taken care of." The house had been Margaret's only asset, bought 30 years earlier with a combination of savings, loans, and sheer determination. It wasn't much: 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen with appliances that predated Nathan's birth, but it was hers. She'd painted every wall, planted the small garden, fixed what she could herself, and saved for months to hire professionals for what she couldn't. When the realtor had told her the house was worth $187 million, Chicago real estate having appreciated far beyond anything she'd imagined, Margaret had been stunned. She'd owned something valuable, something that could provide security for the rest of her life. Nathan had been even more surprised, his eyes widening when she'd shared the news. "Mom, this changes everything," he'd said, hugging her with more enthusiasm than she'd felt from him in years. "You'll never have to worry about money again." The closing had been emotional. Margaret had signed paper after paper, transferring ownership of her life's work to a young couple with 2 small children. As they'd walked through the house one final time, the wife had commented on the garden, asking about the care of the rose bushes Margaret had nurtured for decades. "The previous owner really loved this place," the husband had said to the realtor, as if Margaret weren't standing right there. "You can tell by how well-maintained everything is." Margaret had wanted to tell them about the roses, about which ones bloomed earliest and which needed extra water during hot summers. She'd wanted to explain that the kitchen window stuck but opened easily if you knew to lift while turning the handle. She'd wanted to share the history of every improvement, every repair, every small act of love she'd invested in making the house a home. Instead, she'd nodded silently and walked away from 30 years of memories with nothing but a cashier's check and the promise of being taken care of by the son she'd given everything to raise. Now, 8 months later, she understood what taken care of meant in Nathan's vocabulary. It meant being managed, controlled, reduced to a line item in a household budget. It meant having her autonomy stripped away in exchange for basic shelter and food, like a pet whose care had become inconvenient. Margaret rose from her bed as the first light of dawn crept through her bedroom window. She walked to the small mirror above her dresser and stared at the reflection looking back at her. A woman who'd been hollowed out by decades of giving, her face mapped with lines of worry and sacrifice, her eyes holding the particular sadness of someone who'd loved too much and received too little in return. "Am I being tested or just forgotten?" she whispered to her reflection, her voice breaking on the question that had been haunting her prayers for months. Outside her window, she could hear Carrie's voice in the kitchen below, talking to Nathan about their weekend plans that Margaret knew would not include her. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass and closed her eyes, wondering if this was how Jesus had felt in the Garden of Gethsemane, abandoned by those he'd loved most, facing a darkness that seemed impenetrable. But even Jesus had known his suffering had purpose. Margaret could find no meaning in hers, no greater plan that required her to be reduced to nothing more than an unwanted expense in her own son's life. The days following Nathan's devastating words blurred together like watercolors in the rain. Margaret moved through the house like a ghost, witnessing her own erasure in real time through 1,000 tiny cruelties that cut deeper than any shouted argument ever could. It started with breakfast. For months, Margaret had quietly joined Nathan and Carrie at the kitchen table each morning, grateful for even the illusion of family togetherness. She'd learned to time her arrival perfectly, not too early to seem intrusive, not too late to appear rude. She'd perfected the art of making herself small, speaking only when spoken to, carefully rationing her words like precious coins. But the morning after Nathan's pronouncement, when Margaret appeared in the doorway at her usual time, Carrie didn't look up from her phone. "Oh," Carrie said, her voice flat with manufactured surprise. "I didn't realize you were coming down. I only made coffee for 2. Margaret stood frozen in the doorway, her arthritis-gnarled hands clutching her worn robe. The coffee maker sat on the counter, its glass carafe holding exactly 2 cups, a precise calculation that left no room for error or inclusion. "I can make more," Margaret offered quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Don't bother," Nathan said without lifting his eyes from his tablet, where he was scrolling through stock prices with the focused intensity of a man whose attention was far too valuable to waste on awkward family dynamics. "We're running late anyway." Margaret retreated to her room, where she sat on the edge of her bed for 20 minutes, before venturing back downstairs to make herself a single cup of instant coffee. The cheap kind she'd bought with her own money because she'd noticed the real coffee disappearing too quickly and didn't want to be accused of being wasteful. The coffee tasted like dust and regret. 2 days later, Margaret discovered that her usual spot in the living room, a worn armchair positioned where she could see both the television and the window, had been replaced with a decorative plant stand. The chair itself had vanished completely, as if it had never existed. "Where did my chair go?" she asked Carrie, who was arranging fresh flowers in a vase that probably cost more than Margaret's monthly medication budget. "Chair?" Carrie's perfectly shaped eyebrows rose in feigned confusion. "Oh, that old thing. It didn't really fit with the room's aesthetic. I donated it to charity. I'm sure someone who really needs it will appreciate it." The implications hung in the air like smoke from a house fire. Margaret wasn't someone who really needed furniture in her own son's home. She was merely a temporary occupant whose comfort was negotiable, whose presence was an inconvenience to be managed rather than accommodated. Margaret began eating her meals standing at the kitchen counter, like a servant grabbing a quick bite between chores. When she tried to sit at the dining room table, Carrie would suddenly remember urgent phone calls that required privacy, or Nathan would spread his work papers across the entire surface, effectively claiming the space as his own. The message was clear. Margaret's place in this house was anywhere but where the family gathered. Sunday mornings had always been sacred to Margaret. Even during the most difficult years of Nathan's childhood, they'd attended Mass together at St. Catherine's, where Father Murphy had watched Nathan grow from a fidgety altar boy to a confident young man. Margaret had assumed that tradition would continue, that sharing worship would provide a bridge across the growing chasm between them. She was wrong. The first Sunday after Nathan's cruel words, Margaret dressed carefully in her best dress, navy blue with small white flowers, the same dress she'd worn to Nathan's college graduation. She waited by the front door at 9:15, 15 minutes before their usual departure time, her small purse clutched in her hands and her heart full of desperate hope for spiritual connection. At 9:45, Nathan and Carrie emerged from their bedroom dressed for church, but their faces showed no recognition of Margaret standing ready by the door. "Ready?" Nathan asked Carrie, his hand on the doorknob. "Wait," Margaret said, her voice thin with confusion. "Aren't we going together?" Nathan and Carrie exchanged one of their silent communications, a look that contained entire conversations Margaret wasn't privy to. "Mom," Nathan said with exaggerated patience, "St. Catherine's is pretty far, and the car's only a 2-seater today. We're taking the Mustang." It was a lie. Margaret could see their SUV sitting in the driveway through the window, large enough to seat 7 people comfortably. But lies, she was learning, were easier than honest rejection. "I could take the bus," Margaret offered, hating the pleading tone in her own voice. "The bus?" Carrie's laugh was like breaking glass. "Mom, you can't possibly manage public transportation with your arthritis. What if you fall? What if you get confused about the route?" They left without her, their footsteps fading down the driveway while Margaret stood in the entryway, still dressed for church, still holding her purse, still hoping for a miracle that didn't come. She'd walk to the neighborhood Methodist church instead, a small congregation that welcomed her with warm smiles and gentle handshakes. But even there, surrounded by strangers who treated her with more kindness than her own family, Margaret felt like an imposter. When the pastor asked if anyone had special prayer requests, she'd wanted to stand and say, "Please pray for a mother who has become invisible to her own son." But the words wouldn't come. Instead, she'd sat in the back pew and cried silent tears while the congregation sang "Amazing Grace," wondering if grace was something she'd forfeited through some unknown sin, some failure of motherhood that had turned her child's heart to stone. The medical appointments were the worst humiliation of all. Margaret's arthritis required monthly checkups with Dr. Rivera, a kind woman who'd been treating her for 3 years. Previously, Nathan had driven her to these appointments, sitting in the waiting room with his laptop while Margaret received care. She'd treasured those drives, rare moments when they were alone together, when Nathan would ask about her pain levels and seemed genuinely concerned about her well-being. But after becoming just an expense, the appointments became exercises in public embarrassment. "I can't keep taking time off work for your doctor visits," Nathan announced one Tuesday morning, his tone suggesting that Margaret's medical needs were frivolous luxuries rather than necessary health care. "You'll need to find another way to get there." "I could call a taxi," Margaret offered, though the cost would consume most of her weekly allowance. "A taxi?" Nathan laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Mom, do you have any idea how much taxis cost? That's completely impractical." The solution, Margaret discovered, was for Carrie to drop her off at the medical building like a piece of luggage, with instructions to call when she was finished. Margaret would then wait in the lobby, sometimes for hours, until Carrie remembered to retrieve her, sitting among strangers and trying not to think about how she'd become such a burden that basic transportation was considered an imposition. During one particularly humiliating visit, Dr. Rivera had asked about her living situation. "How are things at home, Margaret? Are you getting the support you need?" Margaret had opened her mouth to speak honestly, to explain that she felt like a prisoner in her own son's house, that she was slowly disappearing into nothingness despite being surrounded by family. But then she'd imagined Nathan's reaction if he learned she'd been complaining to her doctor, imagined the conversation that would follow about her ingratitude and the financial strain she was causing. "Everything's fine," she'd lied, the words tasting like poison in her mouth. "Nathan and Carrie are very attentive." Dr. Rivera's eyes had shown she wasn't fooled. but she'd simply nodded and made notes in Margaret's chart, perhaps recognizing the signs of family abuse that couldn't be treated with prescription medications. The breaking point came on Margaret's 74th birthday, a day she'd been quietly dreading for weeks. In previous years, even when Nathan was busy with work and his own life, he'd always remembered her birthday. A phone call, a card, a small gift that showed he was thinking of her. During the years when money was tight, he'd simply shown up at her door with a homemade card and a promise to take her to dinner when things get better. This year, Margaret woke to silence. She lay in bed listening to the sounds of Nathan and Carrie's morning routine. Showers running, coffee brewing, muffled conversations about their schedules for the day. No one knocked on her door. No one called out birthday greetings. No one acknowledged that this day was any different from the hundreds of other unremarkable days she'd spent slowly disappearing in their house. By noon, Margaret had convinced herself that they were planning a surprise, maybe a small cake after dinner, maybe a family photo to mark the occasion. She dressed carefully in her favorite blouse, the pale pink one Nathan had complimented years ago, and waited for some sign of recognition. At 2 p.m., Carrie left for her yoga class without a word. At 6 p.m., Nathan called from the office to say he'd be working late and would grab dinner with colleagues. At 9 p.m., Margaret sat alone at the kitchen counter, eating a peanut butter sandwich and watching the clock mark the hours of her forgotten birthday. She'd never felt smaller or more invisible in her entire life. That night, Margaret stood in the bathroom she shared with no one, staring at her reflection in the mirror above the sink. Her face looked ancient in the harsh fluorescent light, all angles and shadows, eyes that had seen too much disappointment, skin that bore the weight of 74 years of loving people who'd learned to take her for granted. She clutched her rosary in her trembling hands, the same wooden beads she'd prayed with through Nathan's childhood illnesses, through her husband's abandonment, through every crisis and blessing that had shaped their lives. But tonight, the familiar prayers felt hollow, empty words echoing in a spiritual void where God's voice had once provided comfort. "Am I being tested, Lord?" she whispered to her reflection, her voice cracking with exhaustion. "Or have you forgotten me too?" The fluorescent light flickered once, casting her face in momentary darkness before returning to its merciless brightness. Margaret took it as her answer. Even God, it seemed, had grown tired of her endless needs, her persistent prayers, her inconvenient existence. She stumbled back to her room, her arthritis making each step a small agony, and collapsed onto her bed fully clothed. For the first time in her life, Margaret fell asleep without saying her evening prayers, too heartbroken to believe anyone was listening. The morning after her forgotten birthday, Margaret woke with something she hadn't felt in months: clarity. It cut through the fog of depression and confusion like sunlight-piercing storm clouds, sharp and unmistakable and absolutely terrifying. She'd spent the night having the same recurring dream she'd been haunted by for weeks. She was in her old house, but the rooms kept shrinking around her until she was pressed against the walls, unable to breathe, while voices from another room discussed her situation as if she were already dead. In the dream, she tried to call out, to remind them she was still there, still breathing, still deserving of basic human dignity, but no sound came from her throat. This morning, she'd awakened with her voice intact and a dangerous resolve hardening in her chest like steel. Margaret dressed carefully in her best clothes, the navy dress, her good shoes, the pearl earrings Nathan's father had given her before he'd revealed his true character. She styled her gray hair with more attention than she'd paid to her appearance in months, applied lipstick with steady hands, and looked at herself in the mirror with something approaching recognition. This was the woman who'd raised a son alone in Chicago. The woman who'd worked multiple jobs without complaint. The woman who'd saved and sacrificed and built a life from nothing. Somewhere along the way, she'd forgotten that she was more than her arthritis, more than her medications, more than the sum of her inconveniences. She was still Margaret Ann Whitaker, and she had found her voice. Nathan was in the kitchen when she came downstairs, dressed for work in one of his expensive suits, scrolling through his phone while drinking coffee from the machine that only made enough for 2 people. He didn't look up when she entered, but Margaret could see the subtle tension in his shoulders that suggested he was aware of her presence and annoyed by it. "Nathan," she said, her voice steady and clear. "I need to talk to you." "Kind of busy here, Mom," he replied without lifting his eyes from his screen. "Can it wait until tonight?" "No," Margaret said simply. "It cannot wait." Something in her tone made Nathan look up, his expression shifting from casual dismissal to wary attention. For a moment, he looked like the little boy he'd once been when caught in a lie, defensive but uncertain, preparing for confrontation but hoping to avoid it. "What's this about?" he asked, setting down his phone with the careful precision of a man who'd learned to control every situation through calculated responses. Margaret took a deep breath, feeling the weight of 74 years settling in her chest like armor. "Yesterday was my birthday." Nathan's face went blank, then flushed with what might have been shame if he'd retained the capacity for it. "Oh, Mom, You forgot," Margaret continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Both of you forgot. I sat alone in this house all day waiting for someone to remember that I exist, that I matter, that I'm more than just an expense you pay monthly like a utility bill. Mom, we've been really busy with work." "Busy?" Margaret repeated the word like she was tasting something bitter. "Busy enough to forget the woman who gave you life. Busy enough to ignore the person who sacrificed everything so you could become the success you are today." Nathan's jaw tightened, his business persona sliding into place like protective armor. "I don't think this is the time for emotional manipulations, Mom. We can discuss this tonight when Carrie gets home." "No, Nathan." Margaret stepped closer, and for the first time in months, she didn't make herself smaller in his presence. "We will discuss this now, because I'm done being managed and scheduled and treated like an inconvenience in my own son's life." "Your son's life?" Nathan's voice carried a edge she'd never heard before, sharp and cold and deliberately cutting. "Mom, this is my house, my life, my family. You're here because we allow you to be here, because we're taking care of you out of obligation and love, even though it's making our lives significantly more difficult." The words hit Margaret like physical blows, but instead of crumbling, she felt something inside her crystallize into unbreakable resolve. "Obligation," she repeated. "Is that what you call it?" "What would you call it?" Nathan shot back, his mask of politeness finally slipping to reveal the resentment that had been festering beneath the surface. "You moved in here with nothing but the clothes on your back and a bunch of medical problems. We feed you, house you, pay for your medications. With my money," Margaret interrupted, her voice quiet but carrying the force of absolute truth. "You pay for everything with the money I gave you from selling my house. The house I worked 30 years to pay for. The house that was my security, my independence, my home." Nathan's face flushed darker. "You gave us that money voluntarily. You said you wanted us to take care of you." "I trusted you to take care of me," Margaret corrected. "I thought taking care of someone meant loving them, respecting them, treating them like family instead of like a burden you're stuck with." "We do love you," Nathan said, but the words sounded hollow even to him. "But love doesn't mean we have to pretend this situation isn't difficult. Love doesn't mean ignoring the reality that having another person in our house is expensive and complicated." Margaret stared at this stranger wearing her son's face, this man who'd learned to quantify human relationships in terms of convenience and cost. "When you were 10 years old," she said slowly, "you had pneumonia. Do you remember?" Nathan's expression flickered with confusion at the apparent change of subject. "What does that have to do with anything? You were burning with fever for 3 days. The doctor said it could go either way. I sat by your bed for 72 hours straight, giving you medicine, cooling your forehead, praying to God to spare your life." Margaret's voice remained steady, but her eyes held the weight of every sacrifice she'd ever made. "I didn't sleep. I barely ate. I would have died in that chair if it meant saving you. Mom, I never once thought about how expensive your illness was, or how inconvenient it was to miss work, or how difficult it was to watch you suffer. I thought about how much I loved you and how I would do anything, to make you well." Margaret paused, letting the silence stretch between them. "Would Jesus forgive this too? Should I forgive again?" Nathan's composure cracked slightly, revealing something that might have been conscience struggling beneath layers of self-justification. "That's different. I was a child. You were my child," Margaret said. Just like you're my child now. Just like you'll be my child when I'm dead and gone and you're trying to explain to your own children why their grandmother disappeared from their lives. You're being dramatic. Am I? Margaret's voice rose for the first time, decades of suppressed pain breaking through her careful control. I gave you everything, Nathan. Everything. My youth, my dreams, my financial security, my independence. I gave you the money that was supposed to keep me safe in my old age, and I did it gladly because I believed you when you said you'd take care of me. We are taking care of you. You're managing me, Margaret shot back. There's a difference. Taking care of someone means loving them. Managing someone means controlling them until they become convenient enough to ignore. Nathan opened his mouth to respond, but Margaret held up her hand, the gesture carrying more authority than she'd displayed in years. I'm not finished, she said. You want to talk about expenses? Let's talk about expenses. You want to talk about inconvenience? Let's discuss inconvenience. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small notebook, the one where she'd been keeping track of every slight, every humiliation, every moment of being made to feel worthless in the house her money had helped buy. October 15th, she read aloud. Carrie rearranged the medicine cabinet and put my prescriptions on the highest shelf where I can't reach them. When I asked for help, she said I should ask before taking anything so she can monitor my usage. Nathan's face went pale. Mom, that's for your own safety. October 22nd, Margaret continued, her voice gaining strength with each entry. You told the Hendersons that I was doing well when they asked about me at the grocery store, but you haven't asked me how I'm doing in 3 weeks. I check on you. November 3rd, Margaret read, tears beginning to flow down her cheeks, but her voice remaining steady. You discussed plans to remodel the guest room, my room, while I was sitting right there, talking about me in the third person as if I couldn't hear you. Nathan's hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, his carefully constructed defenses crumbling under the weight of documented evidence of his casual cruelty. November 7th, Margaret's voice broke slightly. My birthday. The day you both forgot I existed. The kitchen fell silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic outside. Nathan stared at his mother, really looked at her, for the first time in months, and Margaret could see the moment when her words penetrated his armor of self-justification. Mom, he said quietly, his voice carrying the first note of genuine emotion she'd heard from him in weeks. I didn't realize. You didn't want to realize, Margaret corrected gently, because realizing would have meant acknowledging that you've become someone I don't recognize, someone your father would recognize. The comparison hit Nathan like a physical blow. His father, the man who'd abandoned them when responsibility became inconvenient, who'd walked away from his family when they needed him most. Nathan's greatest fear had always been becoming like his father, and Margaret had just held up a mirror that reflected his worst nightmare. That's not fair, Nathan whispered. Isn't it? Margaret asked. He left when you became inconvenient. You're doing the same thing to me, just more slowly and with better lawyers. At that moment, Carrie entered the kitchen, her yoga mat slung over her shoulder and her face glowing with the satisfied exhaustion of someone who'd just spent an hour focusing entirely on herself. She stopped short when she saw them facing each other across the kitchen island, tension crackling in the air like electricity before a storm. What's going on? Carrie asked, her voice taking on the carefully neutral tone she used when she sensed emotional complexity that might require her participation. Your mother-in-law was just explaining how ungrateful we've been, Nathan said, his voice dripping with sarcasm as he retreated behind the familiar shield of shared resentment with his wife. But Margaret was no longer the broken woman who'd allowed herself to be dismissed and ignored. She turned to face Carrie with the same steady resolve she'd shown Nathan. I was explaining, Margaret said clearly, that I remember who I am, and I remember that I have choices. Carrie's perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the flash of alarm that crossed her features. For the first time since Margaret had moved into their house, she was looking at a woman who refused to be invisible, who demanded to be seen and heard and respected, and that woman was far more dangerous than a convenient victim. The tension in the kitchen stretched like a wire about to snap when Carrie's phone rang, piercing the charged silence with its shrill electronic demand for attention. She glanced at the screen, then at Nathan, her expression shifting from alarm to relief. "I have to take this," Carrie announced, backing toward the doorway with the phone pressed to her ear. "It's about the Henderson contract." Margaret watched her daughter-in-law flee the scene with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd perfected the art of avoiding uncomfortable conversations. In 30 seconds, Carrie had transformed from potential combatant to absent party, leaving Margaret and Nathan alone with the weight of 37 years of complicated love and fresh betrayal. Nathan slumped against the counter, his expensive suit suddenly looking like a costume that no longer fit properly. For a moment, Margaret glimpsed the exhausted man beneath the corporate armor, someone who'd perhaps been carrying burdens she'd never imagined, fighting battles she'd never known about. "Mom," he said quietly, his voice stripped of its earlier anger. "I never meant for things to get this way." Margaret felt her maternal instincts stir, the old familiar urge to comfort her child when he showed vulnerability. But she'd learned, painfully and too late, that understanding someone's pain didn't mean accepting their cruelty. "I know you didn't mean it," she said softly, "but intention and impact are different things, Nathan. And the impact has been devastating." Nathan's shoulders sagged. "Everything's been so complicated lately. Work is insane. Carrie's been stressed about money, and having another person in the house." He trailed off, seemingly recognizing how his words sounded. "Another person," Margaret repeated. "Is that what I am to you?" "No," Nathan said quickly, then stopped himself. "I don't know. Maybe. Mom, I look at you and I see—" He struggled for words that wouldn't cause more damage. "I see all the ways I've failed, all the things I should have done differently, all the sacrifices you made that I can never repay." Something shifted in Margaret's chest. Not forgiveness, exactly, but a recognition of the truth beneath Nathan's defenses. "So instead of trying to repay them, you decided to resent them?" Nathan's laugh was hollow and self-loathing. "It's easier to make you the problem than to face the fact that I've become someone I swore I'd never be. Someone selfish and ungrateful and—" He paused, the words sticking in his throat. "Someone like him." Margaret saw the tears gathering in her son's eyes and felt her own resolve waver. This was the moment she'd been unconsciously waiting for. The crack in his armor, the admission of guilt, the possibility of redemption. Every maternal instinct screamed at her to rush forward, to comfort him, to assure him that everything could be forgiven and forgotten if only he truly meant his apology. But something else held her back, a voice that sounded suspiciously like her own, speaking words she'd never allowed herself to think. "Love without boundaries isn't love, it's enabling." "Nathan," she said carefully, "I'm going to ask you something. And I need you to think before you answer. If our situations were reversed, if you were 74 years old and I was treating you the way you've been treating me, what would you want me to do?" Nathan's face crumpled as if she'd struck him. "I'd want you to stop. Then, that's what I'm going to do," Margaret said simply. "I'm going to stop enabling this situation. I'm going to stop pretending that my love for you means I have to accept being treated as less than human." "What does that mean?" Nathan asked, fear creeping into his voice for the first time. Margaret reached into her purse and pulled out a business card she'd found online 3 days earlier. A social worker who specialized in helping elderly people navigate family conflicts and housing situations. She'd called the number yesterday, right after her forgotten birthday, and had an appointment scheduled for this afternoon. "It means I'm going to get help," she said, placing the card on the counter between them. "Professional help. From people who understand what it means to take care of someone without destroying their dignity in the process." Nathan stared at the card as if it were a death sentence. "Mom, you don't need outside help. We can work this out ourselves. As a family, we are not functioning as a family," Margaret said firmly. "We're functioning as a hierarchy where I exist at the bottom, and that needs to change." "What if I promise things will be different?" Nathan's voice carried the desperate edge of someone watching control slip through his fingers. "What if we sit down tonight and talk through everything? Set up some ground rules, some boundaries that work for everyone?" Margaret felt the familiar tug of hope, the seductive whisper that maybe this time would be different. Maybe this conversation had finally broken through to the son she'd raised. But she'd played this game too many times before. The cycle of conflict, contrition, and resumed mistreatment that had defined their relationship for months. "Nathan," she said gently, "how many chances does love require?" He opened his mouth to respond, but she continued before he could speak. "Because I've been asking myself that question every night for months. How many times do I forgive? How many excuses do I make? How many promises do I believe?" Margaret's voice remained steady, but tears began flowing down her cheeks. "Jesus said to forgive 70 times 7 times, but I don't think he meant we should forgive our way into becoming doormats." Nathan looked stricken. "Mom, I never wanted you to feel like a doormat." "But that's what I became," Margaret said. "And I let it happen because I was so afraid of losing you that I lost myself instead." She picked up the social worker's card and tucked it back into her purse, the small action carrying the weight of a Declaration of Independence. "I'm going to that appointment this afternoon," she announced. "I'm going to explore my options, and I'm going to pray about what God wants me to do next, because I've been so focused on being the mother you wanted that I forgot to be the woman he created me to be." Nathan's face cycled through emotions: panic, anger, bargaining, and finally, something that might have been respect. "How are you getting there?" he asked quietly. "I called a taxi," Margaret said. "And before you lecture me about the cost, I'm using my own money. The emergency fund I've been hiding in my sock drawer because I was afraid of being completely dependent on people who might decide I'm too expensive to keep." The admission hit Nathan like a physical blow. His mother, a woman he'd reduced to living on a $50 weekly allowance from her own money, had been hoarding cash like a refugee preparing for the next wave of persecution. "Mom, you don't need to hide money." "Yes, I do," Margaret interrupted, "because yesterday proved that my existence in this house depends entirely on your goodwill. And goodwill, I've learned, is a finite resource." She turned toward the doorway, then paused, her hand resting on the frame. "Nathan, I want you to know that I still love you. I will always love you. But I'm done sacrificing my dignity on the altar of that love. I'm done being grateful for scraps when I deserve a place at the table." "Where will you go?" Nathan asked, his voice small and lost. Margaret turned back to face him, and for the first time in months, her smile was genuine. "I'm going to pray about that. And then I'm going to trust that God has a plan that doesn't require me to become invisible to be loved." After Nathan left for work, his goodbye stilted and awkward, loaded with unspoken questions about what her afternoon appointment might bring, Margaret sat alone in the living room where her chair used to be. She'd brought her Bible downstairs and placed it in her lap, but for the first time in months, she didn't immediately open it to seek comfort from familiar passages. Instead, she simply sat in the silence and let herself feel the full weight of what she'd just done. She'd drawn a line in the sand, declared her own worth, demanded to be treated with basic human dignity. The action felt simultaneously liberating and terrifying, like stepping off a cliff while trusting that God would provide wings. Her hands shook as she opened the Bible to Psalm 31, a passage that had sustained her through her husband's abandonment and countless other trials. But today, the words took on new meaning. "In you, Lord, I have taken refuge. Let me never be put to shame. Deliver me in your righteousness. Turn your ear to me. Come quickly to my rescue. Be my rock of refuge, a strong fortress to save me." Margaret closed her eyes and felt something she hadn't experienced in months: peace. Not the fragile peace of someone avoiding conflict, but the deep, unshakable peace of someone who had finally stopped running from the truth. At 2 p.m., Margaret stood at the front window watching for her taxi, dressed in her best outfit and carrying herself with more dignity than she'd felt since moving into this house. The social worker had been kind on the phone, professional but warm, asking questions that suggested she understood the complexity of family relationships when they became toxic, despite everyone's best intentions. The taxi pulled into the driveway, a simple yellow sedan driven by a middle-aged man who smiled genuinely when she approached the car. "Good afternoon, ma'am," he said, getting out to help her with the door. "Beautiful day for a drive." "Yes," Margaret agreed, settling into the back seat with her purse clutched in her lap. "It really is." As the taxi pulled away from the house, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced since selling her own home 8 months ago. She was going somewhere by choice, taking action instead of simply enduring whatever others decided was best for her. Through the rear window, she watched Nathan and Carrie's house shrink into the distance, and instead of sadness, she felt something approaching relief. Whatever happened next, whatever the social worker recommended, whatever path God opened for her, it would be her choice to walk it. For the first time in months, Margaret was no longer just surviving. She was living, and more importantly, she was trusting that God had been waiting patiently for her to remember that she was worth saving. Not just her soul, but her dignity, her independence, and her right to be loved without conditions. The taxi carried her toward an uncertain future, but uncertainty, she realized, was infinitely preferable to the slow death of being someone else's convenient burden. Margaret Ann Whitaker was finally coming home to herself. Margaret returned from her appointment with Linda Morrison, the social worker, feeling as though she'd been handed a roadmap out of wilderness she hadn't even realized she'd been lost in. Linda had listened without judgment, asked probing questions with professional kindness, and most importantly, validated what Margaret had begun to suspect, but had been afraid to voice. What was happening to her had a name, and it wasn't love. Financial abuse, Linda had explained gently, doesn't always look like someone stealing your credit cards. Sometimes it looks like family members controlling your access to your own resources, using your money while limiting your autonomy, or making you feel guilty for having basic needs. The words had hit Margaret like revelation. She'd been so focused on Nathan's emotional distance that she'd failed to see the systematic way her independence had been stripped away, dollar by dollar, decision by decision, until she'd become a prisoner funded by her own life savings. Emotional abuse in families, Linda continued, often masquerades as concern. We're worried about you living alone. We just want what's best for you. You can't possibly manage on your own. But when concern becomes control, when love becomes manipulation, when care becomes a cage, that's when intervention becomes necessary. Margaret had walked out of Linda's office with a folder full of resources: senior housing options, legal aid services, support groups for elderly people experiencing family abuse. But more than the practical help, she'd walked out with something invaluable: permission to protect herself, even from people she loved. The house was eerily quiet when she returned, but Margaret could sense the undercurrent of tension that meant Nathan and Carrie were waiting for her. She'd been gone for 3 hours, longer than any outing since moving in, and she could imagine the conversations that had taken place in her absence. She found them in the living room, sitting close together on the sofa like co-conspirators preparing for battle. Nathan's tie was loosened, suggesting he'd come home early from work specifically for this confrontation. Carrie's yoga outfit had been replaced by something more formal, as if she'd dressed for a business meeting rather than a family discussion. "Mom," Nathan said as she entered the room, his voice carrying the forced warmth of someone who'd spent hours rehearsing his approach. "We were getting worried. How did your appointment go?" Margaret remained standing, recognizing the power dynamic at play. They sat while she stood. They spoke while expecting her to explain herself. They controlled the environment while she remained the supplicant seeking approval for her actions. Not anymore. "It went very well," she said simply, clutching her purse and the folder of resources Linda had given her. "Very educational." Nathan and Carrie exchanged one of their silent communications, eyebrows raised, heads tilted, an entire conversation about strategy conducted without words. "What kind of education?" Carrie asked, her tone suggesting that Margaret's education was somehow threatening to their established order. Margaret sat down in the chair where Nathan sometimes worked on his laptop, claiming the space with deliberate intention, and opened her folder. "I learned about my rights as a senior citizen. I learned about housing options for elderly people who want to maintain their independence. And I learned about financial abuse within families." The words landed in the room like grenades, exploding the careful pretense that this was simply a loving family working through minor disagreements. Nathan's face flushed dark red. "Mom, that's a terrible thing to say. We're not abusing you. We're taking care of you." "Are you?" Margaret asked calmly, her voice carrying none of the pleading desperation that had characterized their previous conversations. "Because Linda, my social worker, helped me understand the difference between taking care of someone and controlling them." "Social worker?" Carrie's voice pitched higher, alarm cutting through her carefully maintained composure. Margaret, you can't be serious. You're involving strangers in our private family business? Margaret looked at her daughter-in-law, this woman who'd never missed an opportunity to exclude her, diminish her, or make her feel unwelcome in what had supposedly become her home, and felt a clarity that was almost spiritual in its intensity. Carrie, she said gently, my well-being is not your private business to manipulate. It's my life to live. But your family, Nathan protested, his voice taking on the quality of someone whose foundational assumptions were crumbling beneath him. Family takes care of family. Family doesn't involve outsiders. Family doesn't abuse family either, Margaret replied. But here we are. Nathan shot to his feet, his carefully maintained composure finally shattering. That's enough. I won't sit here and be accused of abuse by someone we've bent over backward to accommodate. Do you have any idea what you've cost us? What we've given up to have you here? Margaret remained seated, her hands folded in her lap, her voice steady as stone. What you've given up, she repeated. Tell me, Nathan, what exactly have you given up? Privacy. Nathan began counting on his fingers, his voice rising with each item. Space, freedom, the ability to live our lives without worrying about every decision affecting someone else. The guest room that we used to use for friends and family visits, the extra expenses for food and utilities and medical appointments. Paid for with my money, Margaret reminded him quietly. That's not the point. Nathan was shouting now, pacing back and forth like a caged animal. The point is that having you here has made our lives significantly more complicated and stressful. And instead of being grateful, you're calling us abusers. Margaret watched her son's meltdown with something approaching pity. This was the successful businessman, the polished professional, the adult she'd sacrificed everything to raise. And he was having a tantrum because someone had finally held him accountable for his behavior. Nathan, she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent 7 decades learning hard truths about human nature. Sit down. Something in her tone, perhaps the echo of the mother who'd once commanded his respect, who'd guided him through childhood with firm love and clear boundaries, made Nathan stop pacing and, reluctantly, return to his seat. Now, Margaret continued, I want you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to say, because I will only say it once. She opened her Bible to a passage she'd marked during her taxi ride home, the words Linda had recommended when she'd mentioned her Christian faith and her struggle to reconcile forgiveness with self-protection. Ephesians 4:32, Margaret read aloud. Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other, just as in Christ God forgave you. She looked up at Nathan and Carrie, both of whom seemed surprised by the scriptural reference. I have forgiven you. Every slight, every humiliation, every moment you've made me feel worthless, I forgive it all. Nathan's face softened slightly, hope flickering in his eyes. But, Margaret continued, her voice gaining strength, forgiveness doesn't mean I have to continue enabling harmful behavior. Forgiveness doesn't mean I have to sacrifice my dignity to make you comfortable. And forgiveness certainly doesn't mean I have to pretend that love exists where there is only obligation and resentment. Mom, Nathan started to speak, but Margaret held up her hand. I forgive you, but I won't enable you anymore, she said, her words carrying the weight of divine authority. I will not continue to fund a lifestyle that treats me as less than human. I will not continue to live in a house where my existence is seen as an inconvenience, and I will not continue to pretend that this arrangement is working for anyone. Carrie leaned forward, her face a mask of carefully controlled panic. What exactly are you saying, Margaret? Margaret closed her Bible and looked at both of them with something approaching compassion. I'm saying that Linda helped me find a beautiful senior community about 20 minutes from here. Independent living with support services available when needed. My own apartment, my own schedule, my own life. You can't be serious, Nathan said, his voice hollow with disbelief. Mom, you can't live alone. You have medical issues. You need supervision. I need respect, Margaret interrupted. I need dignity. I need to feel like my life has value beyond what I can provide for other people. And I need to know that the people who claim to love me actually enjoy my company rather than enduring it. We enjoy your company, Carrie said automatically, the words ringing false even to her own ears. Margaret smiled sadly. Carrie, when was the last time you and I had a conversation that wasn't about my medications, my doctor appointments, or my supposed limitations? When was the last time either of you asked about my thoughts, my feelings, my opinions on anything that mattered? The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of months of casual dismissal and systematic dehumanization. You've both been waiting for me to die, Margaret said simply, her words cutting through their self-deception like a sword through silk. Not maliciously, not consciously, but you've been waiting for this inconvenience to resolve itself. You've been managing me instead of loving me, and I've been enabling that by pretending it was enough. Nathan's face crumpled. That's not true, isn't it? Margaret asked gently. Nathan, tell me honestly, when you think about your future, your plans, your dreams, do any of them include me as a living, breathing person with needs and opinions and contributions to make? Or do they all assume that someday, somehow, this problem will simply go away? Nathan opened his mouth to protest, then closed it, the words dying unspoken as he confronted the truth of what she was saying. I thought so, Margaret said sadly, and that's why I need to leave. Not because I don't love you, but because I do. Because staying here is turning us all into people we don't want to be. What if we promise to do better? Carrie asked, desperation creeping into her voice. What if we set up some ground rules, some boundaries that work for everyone? Margaret looked at her daughter-in-law with something approaching kindness. Carrie, you've never wanted me here, and that's okay. Not everyone is equipped to live with extended family, but pretending otherwise has been damaging to all of us. So you're just leaving? Nathan's voice carried the wounded tone of a child whose parent was disappointing him. You're just walking away from your family? Margaret stood up, her movements deliberate and dignified. I'm walking toward the life God wants me to have, she said firmly. A life where I'm valued for who I am, not managed for who I'm not. A life where my presence is a blessing, not a burden. And what about us? Nathan asked, tears finally appearing in his eyes. What about your son who loves you? Margaret walked over to Nathan and placed her weathered hand on his cheek, the gesture carrying all the tenderness of their shared history and all the sadness of their current reality. Then learn to love me better, she said softly. Learn to love me as a whole person, not just as someone who exists to make you feel good about yourself. And maybe someday, when you're ready to have a mother instead of a dependent, we can try again. She picked up her folder and walked toward the doorway, then turned back one final time. I'll be out by the end of the week, she said, and I'll be praying for all of us to find our way back to each other with healthier hearts and clearer boundaries. As Margaret climbed the stairs to her room, she could hear the muffled sounds of Nathan and Carrie's voices, urgent, desperate, planning their next move. But for the first time in months, their conversations were about her rather than over her. And that felt like progress. 3 weeks later, Margaret stood in the doorway of her new apartment at Sunrise Manor Independent Living, watching the morning sun stream through windows that belonged entirely to her. The space was modest, a one-bedroom unit with a small kitchen and living area, but it felt vast compared to the emotional confinement she'd endured in Nathan's house. For the first time in almost a year, she'd slept through the night without anxiety dreams, without listening for footsteps in the hallway that might signal another conversation about her inconvenience to others' lives. She'd awakened naturally, stretched luxuriously in her own bed, and made coffee in her own kitchen without calculating whether she was using more than her allotted share of resources. The apartment smelled like the lavender sachets she'd placed in every room and the lemon oil she'd used to polish the simple wooden furniture. Gone were the expensive, sterile surfaces of Nathan's house that made her feel like a stain waiting to happen. Here, everything was designed for comfort rather than display, function rather than impression. Margaret had used a portion of her money, she reminded herself daily, to furnish the space with pieces that reflected her personality rather than someone else's aesthetic preferences. A comfortable reading chair by the window where morning light fell perfectly across the pages of her Bible. A small dining table where she could eat meals at her own pace without feeling rushed or scrutinized. A bookshelf filled with volumes she'd missed during her months of exile from intellectual life. But the most remarkable change wasn't in her physical surroundings. It was in Margaret herself. For the first time in decades, she'd scheduled her days according to her own interests and energy rather than others' expectations. She attended morning prayer service in the community chapel, where Chaplain Roberts, a gentleman in his 60s who'd served 3 parishes before coming to Sunrise Manor, led discussions about scripture that assumed the participants were intelligent adults with valuable insights to contribute. "Mrs. Whitaker," he'd said after her second week of attendance, "your perspective on the Book of Ruth has really enhanced our group's understanding. Have you ever considered leading a study session yourself?" Margaret had been so startled by the suggestion that she'd initially dismissed it. Lead something? Her? After months of being treated as someone whose opinions were irrelevant and whose contributions were unwelcome, the idea of being viewed as capable of guidance felt foreign and slightly terrifying. But Chaplain Roberts had persisted gently. "I've noticed you have a gift for connecting scripture to real-life experiences. The other residents respond to your insights. Would you pray about it?" That night, Margaret had knelt beside her own bed in her own apartment and prayed more honestly than she had in years. "Lord," she'd whispered, "I've been hiding my light under a bushel for so long, I forgot I had one. If you want me to share what I've learned from walking through darkness, please give me the courage to speak." The answer had come not as a dramatic revelation, but as a gentle certainty that settled in her heart like warm honey. She had something to offer. Her pain had purpose. Her survival had meaning beyond simply enduring until death provided relief. Margaret's first Bible study session drew 8 residents, mostly women in their 70s and 80s who'd gathered in the community room with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. She'd chosen to focus on the story of Naomi and Ruth, 2 women who'd lost everything, but found new purpose in supporting each other through grief and transition. "Sometimes," Margaret had begun, her voice shaky but growing stronger with each word, "God asks us to leave everything familiar and follow Him into something completely unknown. And sometimes the people we think will support us are the ones who make the journey most difficult." Eleanor Patterson, a retired teacher who'd moved to Sunrise Manor after her daughter insisted she was too fragile to live alone, had leaned forward with interest. "Are you talking about family?" Margaret had paused, remembering Linda Morrison's advice about the healing power of honest community. "I'm talking about any relationship where love becomes control, where care becomes a cage, where our value as human beings gets reduced to our usefulness to others." The nodding heads around the circle told Margaret she wasn't alone in her experience. As the women began sharing their own stories, children who'd isolated them from friends, relatives who'd taken control of finances, families who'd made major decisions about their lives without including them in the conversation, Margaret realized she'd stumbled into something powerful. She wasn't just leading a Bible study. She was facilitating a support group for women who'd been systematically marginalized by the people who claimed to love them most. By the 4th week, attendance had grown to 15 residents, and word was spreading throughout the facility about the woman in apartment 3B who was helping people find their voices again. Margaret had contacted Linda Morrison for guidance on facilitating conversations about family abuse among elderly people, and Linda had been thrilled to provide resources and training. "You're doing something remarkable here," Linda had told her during one of their monthly check-ins. "Most people who escape controlling situations just focus on their own healing. You're creating a pathway for others to find freedom too." But perhaps the most significant change in Margaret's life came through her friendship with Dorothy Chen, her neighbor in apartment 3C. Dorothy was 79 years old, a widow who'd moved to Sunrise Manor after her husband's death, seeking community rather than isolation. Unlike Margaret, Dorothy's relocation had been entirely her choice, and she carried herself with the confident independence of someone who'd never allowed others to define her worth. "I've been watching you," Dorothy announced one morning when she encountered Margaret in the hallway. "You walk different than when you first moved in. Taller. Like you remember you're allowed to take up space." Margaret laughed. Genuinely laughed. "For the first time in months. I'm still figuring that out. Want some help?" Dorothy's eyes twinkled with mischief. "Because I've got 79 years of experience taking up exactly as much space as I deserve, and I'd be happy to share some wisdom." Their friendship developed with the easy intimacy of people who'd learned to value authenticity over politeness. Dorothy had been a nurse for 40 years, and she possessed both the practical wisdom and emotional directness that came from spending decades helping people navigate life's most vulnerable moments. "The thing about family," Dorothy said one afternoon as they sat on Margaret's balcony watching birds at the feeder she'd installed, "is that blood relation doesn't automatically create loving behavior. Sometimes the people who share our DNA are the least equipped to see us as whole human beings." Margaret sipped her tea, real tea, steeped properly in her own pot, and considered Dorothy's words. "I keep wondering if I failed somehow as a mother, if I loved Nathan wrong, or not enough, or too much." "Honey," Dorothy said gently, "you can't love someone into being the person you need them to be. You can model good behavior, you can set healthy boundaries, you can pray for them daily, but you cannot control how they choose to treat you." "Then what's the point of all the sacrifice?" Margaret asked, voicing the question that had been haunting her prayers for months. "What was the purpose of giving everything if it didn't create the relationship I hoped for?" Dorothy was quiet for a long moment, watching a cardinal work determinedly at the bird feeder. "Maybe the purpose wasn't to create a specific outcome," she said finally. "Maybe the purpose was to teach you about unconditional love, about the strength you didn't know you had, about the difference between loving someone and enabling them." Margaret felt something shift in her chest, not the crack of breaking, but the gentle opening of understanding. "You think God used my relationship with Nathan to prepare me for something else?" "I think God never wastes our pain," Dorothy replied. "Look what you're doing now with those Bible study sessions. Look how you're helping other women find their voices. Would you have been able to do that if you hadn't walked through your own wilderness first?" That evening, Margaret called the one person who'd been waiting patiently for her to feel ready for contact. Her old neighbor from the house she'd sold, Mrs. Elena Rodriguez. Elena was 82, a widow who'd lived next door to Margaret for 15 years, sharing garden advice and holiday cookies, and the comfortable friendship of people who'd watched each other's lives unfold season by season. "Margarita!" Elena's voice carried joy and relief in equal measure. "I have been praying for you every day since you moved away. Are you well? Are you happy?" Margaret surprised herself by answering honestly, "I'm better than well, Elena. I'm free." They talked for an hour, Margaret sharing the story of her months with Nathan and her decision to reclaim her independence. Elena listened without judgment, occasionally making sympathetic sounds that reminded Margaret what it felt like to be heard, rather than managed. "You know," Elena said as their conversation wound down, "my grandson Miguel is coming to visit next month. He's studying to be a pastor, and he's always asking me about women in the Bible who showed courage. I think he should meet you." Margaret's heart swelled with something she hadn't felt in years, the sense that her story might have value to someone, that her experiences could serve a purpose beyond her own survival. "I'd like that," she said, meaning it completely. After ending the call, Margaret sat in her living room with her evening cup of tea, watching the sunset paint her walls with gold and pink light. She opened her Bible to Psalm 1:3, a verse that had taken on new meaning since her move to Sunrise Manor. "That person is like a tree planted by streams of water, which yields its fruit in season and whose leaf does not wither. Whatever they do prospers." For months, Margaret had felt like a tree dying from drought, her leaves withering, her roots starved of the nourishment they needed to survive. But here, in this community of people who saw her value, who welcomed her contributions, who treated her with the dignity she'd forgotten she deserved, she was beginning to bloom again. The phone rang, interrupting her meditation. Margaret's heart clenched when she saw Nathan's name on the caller ID. This was the first time he'd called since she'd moved out, despite her leaving her new number with Carrie. "Hello, Nathan," she said, her voice calm but guarded. "Mom." His voice sounded different, smaller somehow, less certain than the corporate authority she'd grown accustomed to. I've been thinking about what you said, about learning to love you better." Margaret closed her eyes, feeling the familiar tug of hope warring with hard-earned wisdom. "And what conclusions have you reached?" "I think—" Nathan paused, and she could hear him struggling with words that didn't come naturally to someone who'd spent years avoiding emotional honesty. "I think maybe I don't know how to love people without controlling them. And I think maybe I learned that from Dad, even though I swore I'd never be like him. It was the closest thing to an admission of responsibility she'd ever heard from Nathan, and Margaret felt her maternal heart respond despite her determination to maintain healthy boundaries. "That's a start," she said gently. "But recognition and change are two different things. What are you planning to do with that knowledge?" "I don't know," Nathan admitted. "I was hoping maybe you could teach me." Margaret smiled, looking out at the sunset that was painting her world in colors of hope and renewal. "Nathan, I'm not your teacher anymore. I'm your mother. And maybe, if you're willing to do the work of becoming the man I raised you to be, we can learn to be family again. Real family, built on respect instead of obligation." "What would that look like?" Nathan asked. "It would look like you getting some help to understand why you need to control people to feel safe loving them," Margaret said honestly. "It would look like you learning to see me as a whole person instead of a problem to be managed. And it would look like you visiting me here, in my space, where I feel valued and strong, instead of expecting me to come back to a place where I felt invisible." Nathan was quiet for a long moment. Would you be willing to try? If I do those things?" Margaret looked around her apartment, her sanctuary, her proof that she was capable of building a life that honored her dignity, and felt the deep peace that came from knowing she had choices. "Yes," she said softly, "I'd be willing to try. Because that's what love does, Nathan. It hopes, it endures, and it forgives. But it also protects itself enough to survive." After ending the call, Margaret knelt beside her bed and prayed with gratitude that felt like golden light filling her chest. God had carried her through the wilderness and planted her beside still waters. She was no longer just surviving. She was flourishing. 6 months after moving to Sunrise Manor, Margaret Ann Whitaker stood before a gathering of 35 residents in the community center, her voice strong and clear as she concluded her weekly Courage and Faith workshop. The room was filled with women and men who'd found new purpose in their later years, many of whom credited Margaret with helping them rediscover their worth after being discarded by families who'd grown tired of caring for them. "Remember," Margaret said, closing her worn Bible with the reverent care of someone who'd learned to find fresh truth in ancient words. "God doesn't see us as expired or used up. He sees us as refined by experience, seasoned by wisdom, and perfectly equipped to serve His purposes in ways we never imagined when we were younger." Applause filled the room, but more importantly, Margaret could see the light of recognition in eyes that had grown dim with despair. Mrs. Thompson, whose son had placed her in a nursing home against her will and never visited, was smiling for the first time since arriving 3 months ago. Mr. Rodriguez, who'd been convinced his family only tolerated him out of obligation, had started calling his grandchildren regularly, not to ask for anything, but simply to share the stories and wisdom he'd accumulated over 8 decades of living. As the group dispersed, Margaret gathered her notes and materials with the satisfied exhaustion of someone who'd spent her morning pouring herself out for others and been replenished in the process. Dorothy appeared at her elbow, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the knowing smile of someone who'd watched her friend transform from wounded refugee to healing warrior. "Another good session," Dorothy observed, handing Margaret her coffee. "I especially liked what you said about being refined rather than diminished by difficult experiences. Very biblical, very practical, very Margaret." Margaret laughed, the sound carrying none of the anxious undertones that had characterized her laughter during her months with Nathan. "I'm still learning to believe it myself some days, but leading these sessions is teaching me that my story has purpose beyond just surviving it." They walked together toward the large windows that overlook the manor's garden, where October sunlight filtered through trees dressed in gold and crimson. Margaret had planted a small section of the garden herself, roses and lavender and herbs that reminded her of the garden she'd tended at her old house. The physical work had been therapeutic, but more than that, it had been a declaration. She was putting down roots again, investing in beauty she'd be around to enjoy. "Speaking of your story," Dorothy said with studied casualness that immediately put Margaret on alert, "I heard through the grapevine that Nathan called again yesterday." Margaret nodded, her expression thoughtful rather than anxious. "He did. 3rd time this month. Progress?" Margaret considered the question carefully. Over the past 6 months, Nathan had been calling regularly, not with demands or manipulations, but with updates on the therapy he'd started with Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a family counselor who specialized in helping adult children recognize and change destructive patterns in their relationships with aging parents. Some, Margaret said honestly. He's learning to listen without immediately trying to fix or control. He's starting to ask about my life here instead of assuming I'm miserable without his management. And last week, he actually apologized for the way he handled my birthday. Not just a quick sorry, but a real acknowledgement of how devastating that must have been. But, Dorothy prompted, recognizing the note of reservation in her friend's voice. But words and actions are different things, Margaret replied. And I've learned that my peace doesn't depend on Nathan changing. If he does the work and becomes someone I can have a healthy relationship with, that's wonderful. If he doesn't, I'm still complete, still valuable, still living a life that honors God and serves others. As if summoned by their conversation, Margaret's phone rang. Nathan's name appeared on the screen, and Dorothy squeezed her friend's shoulder encouragingly before discreetly moving away to give her privacy. "Hello, Nathan," Margaret answered, settling into one of the comfortable chairs that faced the garden. "Hi, Mom." His voice carried warmth that sounded genuine rather than performed. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "I just finished leading a workshop," Margaret said, noting how natural it felt to mention her activities without downplaying their significance. "But I have time to talk." "A workshop?" Nathan's interest sounded authentic. "What kind of workshop?" Margaret smiled, remembering how 6 months ago, Nathan would have reacted to news of her independence with anxiety and attempts to control her activities. "I help other residents work through difficult family situations. We study scripture together and share strategies for maintaining dignity and faith when relationships become challenging." There was a pause, and Margaret could almost hear Nathan processing the implications of what she'd said. His mother, the woman he'd reduced to a managed expense, was counseling others and being valued for her wisdom. "That sounds really meaningful," Nathan said quietly. "I'm glad you found something that fulfills you." "I didn't find it," Margaret corrected gently. "I created it. Or rather, God created it through me when I finally got out of the way and let him use my experiences for good." Another pause. Longer this time. "Mom, I've been thinking about what Dr. Walsh said in our last session, about how I need to see you as a whole person with your own life and purposes, not just as my mother whose main job is to make me feel good about myself." Margaret felt a flicker of hope, tempered by months of hard-won wisdom about the difference between insight and lasting change. "What conclusions are you drawing from that thinking?" "I'd like to visit you," Nathan said, his voice carrying the vulnerability of someone stepping into unfamiliar territory. "Not to check on you or evaluate your living situation, but to see this life you've built, to meet your friends, to understand what makes you happy now, to get to know the person you are when you're not trying to take care of me." Margaret closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of autumn sunlight on her face and the deeper warmth of cautious hope in her chest. "I'd like that too, Nathan, but I need you to understand something first." "What's that?" "This visit would be about relationship, not rescue. I don't need you to save me or fix anything or determine whether my choices are acceptable to you. I need you to come as my son who wants to spend time with me because you enjoy my company, not because you feel obligated to check on my well-being." "I understand," Nathan said, and for the first time in months, Margaret believed he actually might. "When would be convenient for you?" The question itself was revolutionary. When would be convenient for her? Not when could she accommodate his schedule, not when would be least disruptive to his life, but when would work for her. "Next Sunday afternoon," Margaret said, checking her calendar with the casual authority of someone whose time had value. "I could give you a tour of the facility, introduce you to some of my friends, maybe show you the garden. There's a little cafe here where we could have coffee and actually talk. Not about my medications or your work stress, but about who we are as people." "That sounds perfect," Nathan said, his voice warming with something that might have been genuine anticipation. "Should I bring Carrie?" Margaret considered the question carefully. Carrie had never apologized for her behavior, never acknowledged her role in making Margaret feel unwelcome and unwanted. More importantly, Margaret had learned to protect her peace by limiting exposure to people who drained rather than nourished her spirit. "Not this time," Margaret said diplomatically. "This visit is about you and me rebuilding our connection. When we've done that work, we can talk about including others." "Okay," Nathan agreed readily. "Just us." After ending the call, Margaret sat quietly in her chair, watching birds at the feeder she'd installed outside her apartment window. A year ago, she'd been a woman whose worth was measured entirely by her usefulness to others, whose voice had been silenced by the very people who claimed to love her. Now she was setting boundaries with confidence, protecting her peace with wisdom, and offering relationship on terms that honored her dignity. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, and it hadn't been easy. There had been nights of doubt, moments of loneliness, times when she'd questioned whether choosing herself over keeping peace with her family made her selfish rather than wise. But each day she'd awakened in her own space, made her own decisions, and contributed her own gifts to the community around her. She'd grown stronger in her conviction that God didn't intend for love to require self-destruction. That evening, Margaret attended the weekly worship service in the Manor's Chapel, where Chaplain Roberts was concluding a series on redemption and renewal. As the small congregation sang, "Amazing Grace," Margaret found herself thinking about the journey from the woman who'd been called just an expense to the woman who now knew her true value in God's economy. Her pain hadn't been wasted. Her struggles hadn't been meaningless. Every moment of feeling invisible had taught her to see others who felt the same way. Every experience of being controlled had given her wisdom to help others find freedom. Every night of crying herself to sleep in Nathan's house had prepared her to comfort others who were walking through their own wilderness. After the service, as Margaret walked slowly back to her apartment, she passed the community room where a group of newer residents was gathering for their first support meeting. People who'd arrived recently, fresh from their own experiences of family rejection and institutional placement. Tomorrow, she'd meet with them individually to assess how she might help them navigate their new reality with dignity and tact. But tonight, she simply wanted to sit in her own living room, with her own books and her own music, and thank God for the journey that had brought her home to herself. Margaret settled into her reading chair with a cup of tea and opened her Bible to Isaiah 61:3, a verse that had become her personal anthem. "To grant to those who mourn in Zion, to give them a beautiful headdress instead of ashes, the oil of gladness instead of mourning, the garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair, that they may be called oaks of righteousness, the planting of the Lord, that he may be glorified." She'd received beauty for ashes, gladness for mourning, praise instead of despair. She'd become an oak of righteousness, planted firmly in soil that nourished rather than depleted her. The phone rang one more time that evening. Not Nathan this time, but Elena Rodriguez, her old neighbor, calling with news that her grandson Miguel was engaged and wanted Margaret to be part of the wedding ceremony, perhaps sharing a reading or offering a blessing for the young couple. "He says you understand something about love that he wants to learn," Elena explained. "Something about loving people without losing yourself in the process." Margaret accepted the invitation with joy, understanding that her story was continuing to bear fruit in ways she could never have imagined during her darkest moments. As she prepared for bed that night, Margaret reflected on the question that had haunted her months ago. Am I being tested or just forgotten? Now she knew the answer. She hadn't been forgotten, she'd been prepared. Prepared to understand that true love required courage, that real faith demanded action, and that God's plans for her 70s were more abundant than anything she'd dared hope for in her youth. Margaret Ann Whitaker had been called just an expense by the son she'd sacrificed everything to raise. But God had called her by a different name, beloved, valuable, purposed, and that name she'd learned was the only one that mattered. Has there ever been a time in your life, or in the life of someone you know, when love became a cage rather than a refuge? When family obligations turned into family oppression? How did faith help you or them find the courage to choose dignity over keeping the peace? If this story touched your heart, please share your thoughts in the comments below. If you believe someone in your life needs to hear Margaret's story, someone who's forgotten their worth, someone who's being treated as a burden rather than a blessing, please like this video and subscribe to our channel so this message can reach the hearts that need it most. May God bless everyone who's ever felt invisible in their own family, everyone who's ever been called too much or too expensive or too complicated to love. In Jesus' name, amen.